So our first speaker today is going to be Ed Hughes. Ed is a staff research engineer at Google DeepMind, a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, and has a special place in our heart because he's an advisor to the Cooperative AI Foundation. His PhD is in theoretical physics, but at Google DeepMind, he's helped pioneer the field of cooperative AI, working on cooperation and coordination in multi-agent systems, and also coining the term, along with Alan Defoe, cooperative AI, and putting together the team that wrote the original Open Problems on Cooperative AI paper. Nowadays, he's interested in the intersection of open-endedness and cooperative AI, spanning contributions to the ethics of advanced AI assistance, generative simulations, the theory of open-ended systems, and cultural evolution among AI agents. And he's also a choral conductor and has had made several professional recordings of 20th century music that are featured periodically on the UK radio.
Thanks very much, Jesse.
You, Ed.
And thank you very much for the invitation, the lovely introduction. Huge thanks also to all the organisers, the staff from the foundation. I think you can all agree we've had an amazing couple of days so far. A huge amount of work's gone into it, and it's just such a lovely energy to be here with all of you. I'm going to tell you about my research program, Open-Ended Cooperative AI. I now realize that I should make this talk a theory of change based off what Lewis has just told us. Maybe it is. So we'll figure out as we go along. Please do put your questions on Slido as we go. I think I'm not going to sort of take questions as we go, just in the interest of time. But I'd love to answer questions at the end. I'm also around straight after this for office hours, and I'm around until the middle of the day tomorrow. So if anyone wants to come and find me at any point, I'd love to chat. So open-ended cooperative AI. Well, I'm going to talk to you about four things. I want to talk about open-endedness in nature, open-endedness in AI, a definition of open-endedness, and then open-ended cooperative AI. So I've used this term open-endedness a lot. Can I just get a show of hands who thinks they know what open-endedness is? Good, a few people, that's great. So for those people who think they know what it is, the first part of the talk might be a bit dull, I'm sorry. There's a lot of people who don't know, but hopefully you'll still get something out of it. I'm going to give a particular perspective on it. So this is just a little meme for the structure of my talk. My talk is deliberately going to become more and more confusing and give you more and more questions. And then hopefully as we go up to the top, some of those questions will get answered and we'll come to a point where we understand what's happened. So if we get halfway through this and go, I don't know what's going on, I claim that that's by design. Okay, open-endedness in nature. So here's a rough definition of open-endedness. We'll get a bit more precise later. The rough definition of open-endedness is that open-ended systems endlessly produce new and interesting things. And I claim that, in fact, we're surrounded by open-ended systems. There have been a lot of open-ended systems in the history of the universe. I don't know, can anyone give me an example of an open-ended system? Yes? Evolution, excellent. Any other examples of open-ended systems people can think of? Specific or general? Yeah? Yeah, absolutely. Fractal? Yeah, fractal, yeah. Cool. Okay. Yeah, we've got, and in fact, all of these are different. What's interesting about that is like it's kind of multi-scale, right? We've had answers at the broad scale to the narrow scale, and that's a feature of open-endedness in nature. So I'm going to give three rather broad examples that I think encompass the things that we've just discussed. So one open-ended system, of course, is the autocatalytic system that gave rise to life. It's a really interesting book by Terence Deacon about this from about 10 years ago. I'd recommend reading. So one of the theories for the start of life is that you have a bunch of autocatalytic chemical reactions which produce a hull that then encloses those chemical reactions, and then that enclosed protocell, if you like, can move to a new place, but the hull is unstable and breaks down, and then that allows the cell to gain new chemical inputs and possibly to break into two. And now you have the start of replication, and you also, in some sense, have the start of sort of goal-oriented behavior, right? The emergence of suddenly the goal-oriented behavior of moving to a new place, getting some new chemicals, putting those together to form new molecules that form the hull, and then replicating itself. So that's one sort of open-ended process that seems to require some cooperation between the autocatalytic process in the heart of the cell, and the hull, the formation and destruction of the hull that happens periodically. Another one that was just mentioned is this is biological evolution, of course. Here is the phylogenetic tree of life, or at least a very high-level view of it. And of course, cooperation seems to be really important also in the phylogenetic tree of life. And I'll talk a little bit about 3 places where cooperation comes in just a moment. But certainly, this seems to create both novelty and interesting novelty, right? The filling of different niches in different ways, the emergence of a huge amount of complexity across the major transitions of evolution. And the third example is cultural evolution, which you can also see as a phylogenetic tree. Cultural evolution is essentially just Darwinian evolution by natural selection, but applied rather than in the space of genes, in the space of behaviors. And it's what hopefully is happening now. I'm communicating something to you, and that's mutating in your mind in some ways. Hopefully I'm slightly unclear, just unclear enough for you to get a different representation to what I've got in my brain and then do something interesting with it. And here's an interesting example of the phylogenetic tree. This is the phylogenetic analysis of afterlife beliefs in Islam. And there's another one I found here, which was trumpet valves. There's people who've also studied that. Interestingly, not many people had done a phylogenetic analysis of science and technology. So maybe there's a collaboration there between AI researchers and cultural evolutionary psychologists to come. So you can think in some sense of the archetype of natural open-ended system as evolution by natural selection. And I really like this quote by Susan Blackmore that evolution by natural selection is very, very simple and not at all obvious. It's very simple in the following sense, which Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett wrote a lot about in the 80s and 90s. Evolution by natural selection is a substrate neutral algorithm, which means that it happens on any substrate whenever the following conditions are satisfied. Whenever there's variation, that is that the individuals in the population vary in some ways. There's selection, which means there's some differential survival of some traits over other traits. And there's transmission, in that the traits get passed on from the parents to the offspring. You can think of that as biological parents or biological offspring, or you can think of that as the parents being the idea I've got in my brain and the offspring being the idea you've got in your brain, for instance. And the magical thing about evolution by natural selection, the power of the idea is that whenever you've got these 3, evolution by natural selection has to happen, right? And I think that's what's both very simple and kind of not at all obvious that this is the case, and it's why the universality of that is why it has taken root in so many different parts of life on Earth. So, okay, I told you about the importance of cooperation. Why is cooperation seem to crop up in all of these examples? Well, I claim there's 3 reasons why cooperation crops up. Firstly, natural open-endedness seems to create complexity by allowing species to coexist in different niches. So often one thinks of evolution as, in some sense, a competitive thing, right? Survival of the fittest, right? It feels like it implies competition. But if you think a little bit harder, you realize that the reason that evolution creates complexity is the absence of competition. And I'll give you a little vignette from a lovely book I'll mention later by Ken Stanley and Joel Lehman. If you imagine that there was no selection pressure on the Earth, and then you think, would we be here? The answer is yes, of course we would. Because everything that could possibly have survived would have survived, including the lineage that created us. So we would still be here. Of course, there'd be lots of other things that would be here, and it's not very realistic because we would need an enormous amount of compute, but selection actually narrows things down. It optimizes. So there's a role for cooperation, or at least a role for avoiding competition in allowing species to explore the space and to survive in different niches. Second reason why cooperation seems to be important for natural evolution is that by cooperating, individuals can unlock the next level of energy abundance. So if you come together as a group of individuals aligned to an aim, you get an affordance which then allows you to extract more energy per unit from the environment. And this gives you more ways of meeting the minimal criterion for evolution. So if you think about what evolution is doing, it's not an optimization algorithm. It's not trying to get the best performing individual. It's just trying to get enough to get over the survival barrier, right? And so it's a very different kind of algorithm. And once you can get more energy out of the environment, you can then find different ways of meeting that criterion. And then you have this explosion in interesting novelty that's characteristic of open-endedness. So in other words, cooperation relaxes a selection pressure. It encourages variation. Okay, the third reason why cooperation is interesting is that cooperation itself is a source of new challenges for a group to overcome. And we've heard a lot about the challenges that we're going to face as we have put AIs into the mix as well. So that's a lot of what we think about at the foundation and in this room. And of course, this seems to be the case both throughout the history of biological evolution and throughout the history of human cultural evolution. You get new niches of solutions as populations grow. You get new types of cooperation problems as you have new technologies or new types of individuals. You now have to figure out how you evolve your normative infrastructure, how you evolve your institutions in order to maintain the cooperation. So this now applies a new selection pressure, but now it's at the group level. How do you get the group to continue to cooperate? It also has an interesting impact on variation in that it quantizes the variation. So different groups pick their niches, and then you try to sort of, if you're a new group, you then have to pick a niche which is sufficiently different from the niche which the first group has picked in order to then be able to survive the competition. And this leads me on to my final point. Competition is important as well. I'm not saying competition isn't important, and I think this is a wider point we should remember as cooperative AI people. The mission of cooperative AI is not to stop competition. Right? Competition is very important. It's to realize the importance of cooperation alongside competition and to balance them. And so, of course, what competition does is it deepens the exploitation of a particular niche. So once you have a new individual in a niche, that individual reproduces, you then get competition between the individuals in the niche, and the individuals that are better able to exploit that niche are more likely to survive. So it, in fact, makes you go sort of further down the rabbit hole in a particular niche. And so you can think of competition really like optimization, just like we do in zero-sum two-player games. Zero-sum two-player games effectively are just an optimization problem because you can go towards the unique niche. Okay, so that's open-endedness in nature. I keep checking the time. Good. Let's think about open-endedness in AI for a moment. So I'm going to take you away from cooperation. So it's going to feel like we've left cooperation behind. Then we're going to come back and see where the cooperation has gone. So open-endedness in AI has been studied for a long period of time. It was studied so way back actually in the Dartmouth workshop. If you go back to the original proposal for the Dartmouth workshop, which I really recommend you read. It's only about 2 pages long. A lot of it's still extremely relevant today, despite the fact it's 60 years old. A lot of the things that were being talked about there were, in fact, how do we make open-ended, self-improving, creative systems. So it really dates back at least to the kind of founding of the field. However, more recently, the zeitgeist of the most powerful models we have is deep learning and is optimization. It's not open-endedness. So I'm going to start there in order to give us a contrast to open-ended processes. So this should be not surprising to anyone. How do you build a large language model? Well, you scrape a bunch of data from the internet. You optimize a learning objective, which is just predicting the next token. You pick some appropriate architecture with the right inductive bias and with many weights, and you get a large language model, which is pretty good at being a simulacrum of human language. You can further specialize this to human values and human interaction by collecting further data from humans. You use the same learning objective, then you supervise fine-tune, and you can use that, for example, to specialize it in a particular area or to fill in gaps in your knowledge from the data set that you started with. And then, of course, if you want to turn this into a chatbot, for example, if you want to align it in particular ways, you can collect interaction data through a process like RLHF, or nowadays people tend to use these methods which, rather than building a reward model, use the preferences directly in something like direct preference optimization. And then you still have an optimization function here, right? You collect the preferences and then you do something a little bit like maximum likelihood estimation. You propagate the gradients and hope that you're going to reach the optimal performance according to these preferences. However, these things are less intelligent than humans, and there's lots of anecdotal evidence for that, but I want to give you a particular perspective on why they're less intelligent than humans. And I think the reason why is that there are lots of places where the human researcher has been in the loop in this optimization-based story, right? The human researcher has collected the data set of examples, they've decided upon the objective, they've programmed the learning algorithm, but all of these things are not things that you require someone to do, right? Sitting there. No one is there going, okay, here's your data set of examples, here's your objective, here's your learning algorithm. You go and you seek out, you decide whether to come to this summer school. When you come to the summer school, you decide whether to come to this talk. When you come to this talk, you decide whether to listen to the talk or check your emails, right? And all this depends on your objective, it depends on your learning algorithm, it depends what examples you think are relevant to you. So humans can seek new information, explore without an overall objective. They can modulate their own learning using feedback in real time. And incidentally, just as a hint of what's to come, these skills are really important skills for cooperation, right? And you may sort of start getting echoes in reading that skill list of the things that Gillian was talking about with normative infrastructure, that Nisarg was talking about with social choice, that Joe was talking about yesterday with mediated agreements. All of these things seem to require you to go and sort of get some new information to understand how that information changes your beliefs about other people, and then to update those beliefs, to update your strategy in collaboration to reach some goal, for some joint goal, or to guarantee some outcome for yourself. So there's a big space of a large amount of cooperation is not something you can zero shot, it's something that you have to few shot. These are also the kinds of things, going back 40 years or so, that symbolic AI and indeed game theory were invented to solve, right? When you want reliable reasoning using abstractions, and you're allowed to set up the abstractions, and you haven't got a large amount of data, right? Symbolic AI game theory actually do a pretty good job. The question, the problem with them, of course, is coding in the abstractions. Doing that by hand, it turns out, doesn't scale. But if you've got a way of getting the abstractions, then I think there's starting to be very good evidence that some of these much older ideas can be used very profitably to achieve both open-endedness and cooperation. We'll come back to that. So in summary then, optimization is great. It's fantastic. We should keep doing it. But it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient for open-endedness. It's not sufficient for cooperative AI. Because what it's good at doing is knowledge recall, prediction, instruction following, interpolation, but it's not particularly good at reasoning, at exploration, at extrapolation, at cooperation. And there's a bunch of literature that points in that direction. So, what's the missing piece, right? And the missing piece is going to be open-endedness. I'm going to take you on a bit of a detour, kind of for fun, a bit of a palate cleanser, that's going to introduce a completely different paradigm. And then we're going to see how that combines with foundation models. So who's heard of pick breeder before? Cool, not that many of you. Okay, those of you who haven't heard of this are in for an absolute treat. This is just really fun research. I've stolen these slides shamelessly from Ken Stanley, so thank you, Ken. So Pick Breeder was a project that was run by Jimmy Secretan, Ken Stanley, and a few collaborators in the late 2000s, and they had developed a mechanism for evolving the topologies and weights of neural networks to produce images, and they wanted to try and produce more interesting images from this evolution procedure. And what they were discovering was they could produce kind of images like this, but guiding the evolution to produce interesting images given a compute budget was really, really hard. So they had the brainwave, the internet's pretty mature, social networks are out there by now. Why not just do some citizen science and let people choose the images. So they've developed this little graphical interface. They put this on the internet for people to use, and they said, okay, based on the images you see here, which one's your favorite, right? And then the person would choose an image, and then they'd apply their mutation algorithm, and that would say, okay, well, given this image, now here's the children of that image. And then they'd say to the people, okay, well, we'll pick another image. And so maybe they say, okay, well, that one's my favorite. And they kept doing this, right? So the idea was, well, was this going to produce interesting images? And just to give you a sense of like the challenge of the problem, what they were starting with, this is the search space they started with. This is if you just take random weights, random topologies. These do not look like interesting, or at least interesting to humans images. Some of them are somewhat beautiful and intriguing, but not particularly human relevant. So the question is, if you run this algorithm and you let humans start to choose these things, and furthermore, you let this operate in a network of humans where any human can take an image that any other human has previously chosen and then continue to mutate it and then select based on interestingness, what kind of things do users find? And the answer is these things. I think that's extraordinary, right? You're looking at these and, there's a butterfly there, right? There's a car, there's a skull, there's a candle. These are things that just purely from selection of humans, you end up with these images. And that's not the most exciting bit. Most exciting bit is to come. Okay. So the really interesting thing here is if you look at the stepping stones that were on the way to these images. So if you look at this kind of teapot thing on the top left, if you go back to the stepping stone a few generations before, you have this thing which looks a bit like an egg with a hat on it. It doesn't really look like a teapot. Or Jupiter in the bottom left, this the thing that comes before it is this thing that looks like a sort of letter G that's on its maybe in profile, right? So none of these stepping stones resemble the final object. People were only being asked locally, is this an interesting image? They weren't being asked to produce Jupiter, produce a butterfly, right? And that was really important. So the lesson here is you can only find things by not looking for them. And this slightly echoes something that Lewis was saying earlier, actually, about the way to do research. And I'd say, actually, this is part of now my research philosophy is, don't make a plan for exactly where you think things are going to be in 5 years' time. Pick something that's interested and maybe a bit neglected and tractable and make progress on that locally. And then the stepping stones will reveal themselves. Okay, this is the best bit about this project. The kicker is, well, you'd think, okay, maybe we just optimize, right? We optimize. Now we know you can produce a skull. The only reason we couldn't produce a skull before is because we didn't know there was a skull. We just optimized for the skull. We'll start taking steps in this evolutionary process, and we'll select based on whether it's closer to the skull in pixel space, right? And the thing in the purple box there is what happens if you try to do this evolutionary algorithm where you're selecting for things that look more skull-like. It doesn't produce skulls. It produces these kind of circles. They're circles, but they're pretty boring, right? So automating evolution with a fitness function based on the similarity to target images fails. What's really important is that you do things locally and you move along the stepping stones. So this is, I think, the essence of what open-endedness gives you that optimization doesn't. There's something there in open-endedness that optimization can't capture. Now, in a moment, I'll tell you what this algorithm D is, which is not optimization. This is where you can replace the human in the loop with an AI. So AIs can actually do the selection for you. And the things in image D on the bottom right there, those do look like skulls. Okay, so let's just pause, take a few lessons for a moment. So the lessons are, evolution with a good selection and mutation operator can generate interesting novelty. Remember, I claimed that interestingness and novelty, these were the things that were the properties, the definition, my rough definition of open-endedness. The stepping stones need not, and often do not, resemble the final product. And optimizing for a global objective doesn't give you the right thing, okay? But, this is also not produced the missing piece to get to human level intelligence or human level cooperation, there's several big problems here. Pickbreeder had humans in the loop for local selection. That doesn't sound very scalable. And the mutation operator in Pickbreeder is just mutating the weights and topology of neural network to produce some images that are in fact pretty small. That is also not generalizable to the kinds of things that we want from general intelligence. Okay, so how do you take humans out of the loop? So I'm going to talk first about how do you take humans out of the loop in terms of the selection, and then I'm going to tell you about how you take humans out of the loop in terms of the mutation. So quality diversity, how did they produce these skulls? And this is work by Murray and Clune, and then Murray also did this nice review paper that you can find online in 2020. So the algorithm that they developed to produce these interesting open-ended images, or indeed more generally interesting open-ended behavior, was an algorithm called MAP-ELITE, and MAP stands for Multidimensional Archive of Phenotypic Elites, and it will probably become clear to you why that's the name in a moment. So the way this algorithm works is you start with some phenotype space. Let's suppose you're evolving the morphology of some robots that are trying to run faster, right? So your phenotype space could be the length of the legs and the weight of the torso. Those could be the two features. You also have some genotypes of these things. Maybe the genotypes are the weights and topology of the neural network, for example, or maybe they're hyperparameters of the neural network. So you start by seeding this space randomly. So you randomly seed some genotypes. You now have, you work out their phenotypes and you stick them into this phenotype space. Now you select some parents from different cells of the phenotypes. You do some kind of genetic variation or crossover according to a mutation operator, which at the moment we're saying is hand designed. And this now gives you a new individual. And you do two things with the new individual. Firstly, you figure out what its phenotype is now. And its phenotype may well now be in a different box to the one it was in. And secondly, you figure out what its fitness is. So the fitness might, as I said earlier, it might be how fast this new thing runs. And what you do then is you put the new individual into the new box if it's better than anything you've seen before. You can make that a bit fuzzy, you can introduce errors, you can have multiple things in boxes if you want, but the real idea is kind of maintain an elite in each box across this multi-dimensional phenotype space. And what you find is that, in fact, this starts to produce really interesting individuals that are very good at the thing that you want them to do. So if you look at, this is a phenotype space, 2D phenotype space of the type I've just told you about, and I'll tell you what it corresponds to in a second. But if you look at the lineage of solutions that end up where the red dot is here, it turns out that they have jumped around all over this phenotype space. And if instead you try to do optimization remaining within one box, you can't get to a solution of the same quality. So what's really important, it's exactly the stepping stone phenomenon. You can't predefine the bounding box for the phenotype. The notion of goal switching is really, really important, the notion of going on these stepping stones and then eventually reaching the final solution. So it's exactly doing the same thing we saw that humans were doing with selection, but now it's doing it automatically. And so in this case, actually what they had was soft robot morphologies in simulation. So I think it was their phenotype was something like the amount of the hard bone material and maybe something to do with the overall size of the robot. And they find all of these different ways in which these soft simulated robots can walk, including bipeds, tripeds. They had some jumping ones. They had ones that seemed to have two arms that were pulling each other along. And they not only achieved better performance, but they also covered the entire space here. Whereas the typical evolutionary algorithms that just sort of select greedily had lower performance, and they found one solution, which wouldn't generalize. So here's the lessons. You don't need a human in the loop for selection, great, but a human designed the search space, right? So we're still cheating. and the human designed the mutation algorithm. So, time for it now. Everyone's gone to sleep because we've had half an hour of speaking. Yep. Here's a question for you. Is there anything that we can use to replace the human in the loop for these things? Can anyone think of something we can use? Yes. Exactly. We can use a foundation model, particularly a large language model, to put in the loop, and then hopefully, because they're good models of humans, they'll be able to do exactly this. And so now, and this is what brings us to neuro-symbolic methods, which I mentioned earlier. We're going to still do the same sorts of algorithms where we have some representation space in which we are doing the evolution, but now we're going to power the mutation and selection of that evolution with foundation models. And now this is bringing us right up to date. This is a paper from last month, I think, called Omni-Epic, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I'll tell you what it stands for. It's open-endedness via models of human notions of interestingness, which basically means we're going to use a language model to do the selection in place of a human, with environments programmed in code, which basically means we're going to use a language model writing code to do the mutation in place of the human. This is another paper by a few people in Imperial and Vancouver, so same group of people who were involved in some of the previous work. And the way it works is as follows. It's a really nice, fits on one slide mechanism. So just as we had before, we have some starting seed archive of, here we're going to talk about reinforcement learning tasks. So now we're going to try and produce agents that are good at solving these tasks. So you see this by programming some environments. And I think they use the PyBullet framework here. So it's all these nice kind of 3D simulated Python environments. And you, first of all, you select a task or some tasks from the archive. And then you ask the task generator to produce you a new task by doing some crossover purely in language space. So you say, okay, well, I've got a task. Here's the description of the task. It's a task where you have to bounce over some of these, you have to jump over some obstacles, and then you have to go round a cylinder in the right direction to get to the goal. And I've got another task which involves going up a ramp. Could you produce for me a task which combines those? And then the task generator, with a little bit of few-shot prompting, says, okay, well, I've got one where I've got the obstacles and now on a ramp, right? So you now have a task description in natural language of a new task. Then use another large language model, and it writes code. It says, okay, well, you know, I've got a description of a new task. I can write the code of that task because I know a lot about PyBullet. I know a lot about how to write Python code. And so now you have the dynamics, the transition function written in Python, and you have the reward function also written in Python. And, you know, that might not always work, so you can iterate on the compiler errors every time it says, okay, well, actually, you know, this isn't a line of Python. You say, okay, well, here's your error. Here's what the interpreter said, and now fix that. And this works well enough to get some environment code. Then you get, guess what? Another language model to decide, okay, have you produced a environment which is interesting or not? So based on the code and based on the description of the environment, is this likely to be something that we want to train an agent on? Or have you just, for example, you know, maybe the model has decided, okay, I've had an environment with obstacles that appear vertically upwards and an environment with obstacles that appear vertically downwards. And maybe my environment that I find by combining those is now an environment with no obstacles at all. Well, that's not worth training an agent on. It can probably figure out how to navigate that environment. So the model of interestingness can now do the selection for you and save you a bunch of time training an agent with RL and realizing it hasn't actually made the agent any more generally capable. So finally, you train an agent with reinforcement learning, and then you have a success detector. So the success here, importantly, is not the reward. The reward is being used in the loop to train the agent, but you want a separate success detector. If you like, now you've got sort of this is almost like a separation between train and test. You now want a separate success detector to see, did you actually solve the thing that the environment has asked you to do? Because maybe the reward function that the environment generator produced just wasn't good enough. Or maybe the environment was impossible even with that reward function. So the success detector then determines whether you either add it to the archive and tag it as something it's solved, or you add it to the archive and tag it as something that's not solved. And it turns out that what you get here is now a explosion in complexity of the environments, really looking like a phylogenetic tree, like the things I showed you in the natural evolution before. And you get an agent which is now being trained across a curriculum that can do a larger and larger number of tasks, where there's now been no human in the loop designing, in some sense, the search space or designing the selection. So just to give you a flavor of what these things look like, here's a few prompts. So it's really quite simple. Task generator, you just tell the large language model, you're an expert in curriculum learning, reinforcement learning. Your goal is to help a robot master a diverse set of interesting tasks in simulation in PyBullet. You'll be provided with a list of the tasks they've successfully learned and their code and the list of the tasks they can't do. Now make a new one. Right? And then the bottom left, the environment generator, it takes the output of the first one. It says, okay, well, you've been given this description of the task, and with pairs of task description environment code as few shot examples, your objective is to write environment code that rigorously aligns with the task description, helping the robot learn the task as effectively as possible. And then the third bit, you've now taken the output of the first two. You're an expert in curriculum learning and reinforcement learning. Your goal is to help a robot master a diverse set of interesting tasks in simulation. You'll be provided with a list of old tasks and a new task. Your objective is to determine whether the new task is interesting or not. And here we have exactly the encoding of that notion of interesting and novel that I gave you right at the start, which is characteristic of open-ended systems. So here's an idea of the kind of tasks that it produces. The first few tasks are seeds in the top left, and then it starts producing all these really interesting tasks, including one of my favorite ones. It comes up with destroying a tower of blocks in the bottom, in the middle at the bottom, which is just pretty cool thing for it to have come up with. This is absolutely nothing like the seed tasks at the top. And very like actually what you might give kids in sort of nursery, right? A lot of these look like things that kids in nursery would do. And here's the phylogenetic tree that results from that process. A few caveats to that, but I will. You can ask me afterwards in the interest of time. Okay, I'm going to jump. I'm going to flash this as an idea, and then I'm going to jump to a couple of other things just the interest of time. But this is not a kind of one-hit wonder. OmniEpic is not the only paper doing this. In fact, a large number of other papers. Some of you might have seen the Voyager paper last year, the Eureka paper out of NVIDIA, a paper called FunSearch out of Google DeepMind earlier this year. In FunSearch, it wasn't trying to create agents in simulated environments. The aim was to create genuine new mathematical knowledge. And it was a very similar idea as OmniEpic. Here you represent the solutions as code. You have some program evaluator as the fitness, and you have a mutation as a large language model prompting based on previous programs. And it turns out you can, in fact, using an algorithm very like MapElite's, exactly this sort of idea of designing a search space and keeping the solutions far enough apart to maintain the diversity, then you can generate new solutions to things like bin packing problems, which is quite fun. So here, it's getting a better performance than these well-known heuristics for bin packing problems across a bunch of different data sets, which is what's along the columns here. And it discovers kind of sort of interesting heuristics, right? And one thing that's a side point that's kind of nice about these heuristics that it finds is that they are at least somewhat interpretable. This is not completely a black box. You can look at this. I mean, you might go, okay, why is it adding, 0.56 multiplied by 0.56 or adding 0.16? But you could then go and analyze this mathematically because everything is in code, so you can inspect that as a human and understand what it is that's been discovered. Okay, so I want to tell you a bit about the definition of open-endedness. I want to come back to the notion of cooperation as well before we finish. So this was the slide from the start, and I told you that cooperation was important. This is what I've just told you about. Maybe you understand it a little bit more. But hang on, where did the cooperation go? I've just talked to you for 20 minutes, and the cooperation seems to have disappeared. And I think that's a good thing because it means that there's interesting work for us to do. There's interesting new ideas by fusing these areas, reframing, I think, as Lewis was talking about earlier. And I've been talking about this rough definition, but you know what? It's a bit dissatisfying to say open-ended systems endlessly produce new and interesting things. Can we be more precise about that? And just as a little side note, I think there's a nice reason why it's good to be precise about that. Thomas Kuhn made this point very eloquently in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He talked about paradigms. He was the person who came up with this notion of scientific paradigms. And a paradigm is happens in science when there is some accepted foundations for the field and people can do normal science based on those foundations. And open-endedness, if I claim it's kind of coming of age, if it's going to be a foundation for building both cooperative AI and more intelligent systems, we really do need a paradigm that's a little bit more precise than new and interesting, or at least, or to put it another way, Michael, Dennis, and I were annoyed that there wasn't a paradigm that was more formal than new and interesting, so we made one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, how do we make a real definition, and then I'm going to explain where cooperation has gone. And I hope that the organizer will forgive me, I might go a few minutes over. Right, this is the point where you're meant to be maximally confused. So from this point onwards, if you're getting more confused, that's my fault. Okay, definition of open-endedness. What do we mean by open-endedness? Great, thanks. If we want to be more precise. So I'm going to claim that from the perspective of an observer, a system is open-ended if the sequence of artifacts it produces are both novel and learnable. So all I've done so far is replace new and interesting with two more words I haven't defined. Okay, so far I've done nothing. Great, but I will tell you what I mean by those words precisely. Before that, let me be more precise about what the system's doing. So a system could be anything. It's just something that throws artifacts at you. Those artifacts you can think of as, okay, there may be new individuals in a species, there may be new types of cake, they may be new types of music, they may be new types of fractal, all these things that emerged earlier. And you get this conveyor belt of artifacts, and they come out periodically indexed by time. And then you have an observer. The observer can't affect the system, but it can see the artifacts. And the observer sees the artifacts up to some certain time point, little t, and it produces a statistical model based on those artifacts of what it thinks the future artifacts are going to be. And then it tries to, and so that statistical model is history dependent, it's indexed by little t as well. And it then tries to predict future artifacts. And there is then some prediction error. Oh dear, everything's falling apart. Fix that. There is some prediction error between the statistical model yt and the artifact in the future xt. So that's going to be important. That's what I'm going to call L. That's so you can think of it as a loss function. So now I can tell you what novel means and what learnable means. So novel means if I fix my observer's seen things up to time point little t. And then the observer starts to look at things in the future. Those should become increasingly unpredictable. So it's like saying, okay, I'm going to put myself in the 13th century. I'm going to start looking forward. I'm going to look at what happened in the 14th century in terms of technology, 15th century, 16th century. I start getting, more and more surprised, perhaps perturbed by the things I see. They become more and more unpredictable in some sense to me. Okay? So that's novelty, but that's not enough for open-endedness by itself. I'll tell you why in a moment. Okay. Learnability is sort of a complementary thing, but looking from backwards to the present day rather than the present day forwards. So you imagine that you're fixed now, and you then, that your new artifact is fixed now, and your observer is looking at more and more artifacts from the past. And the system is learnable once you take more and more artifacts, things become more and more predictable. And this is quite familiar to you, I claim, as PhD students, in the sense that as you learn more and more about your subject, from undergrad through masters, through PhD to the present day, something like OmniEpic I've just shown you, something like large language models, they become more and more predictable. You understand more and more about them. So this is a really important structure. It means that there's an ordering to the things, a curriculum to the things, which give you more and more information as you look at more of the objects in the history. So here's an example of something where novelty fails. This is a TV screen that's showing some sort of random static. Imagine that your artifacts is you're just looking at the random static on the TV screen every second. I claim that's not a very good open-ended system. It's not sort of interesting, right? And the problem with that, of course, is that the system is learnable, right? You can get sort of more and more. You can, if you decide you haven't seen the TV screen before, and I start showing you this TV screen, you can become more and more sure that it produces uniform random noise. But at some point, and to start with, it starts off novel, right? You're like, okay, well, I haven't seen that TV screen before. But at the point where you've decided it produces random noise, it's no longer novel, because the expected loss is not increasing. You know it produces random noise. You've modeled the distribution, right? Okay, so now I claim that another thing that's not interesting is if I gave you lots and lots of TV channels in a random order, and those TV channels had nothing to do with each other. So slightly abstruse construction, because all TV channels have something to do with each other. They're all grounded in human knowledge. But let's just presume that you kind of forgot about that for a moment. Well, that would give you novelty. I could even order them so they may be increasingly novel based on your prior knowledge. But it wouldn't be learnable. If there's no correlation between one topic and another, it doesn't appear learnable. And so you can do this as an experiment yourself. You can go onto Wikipedia, you just click random articles, and you'll find that the articles in general don't give you that much information about the next article. Eventually they will, because all human knowledge is somehow connected, but at least locally they won't. So you kind of need both for open-endedness to work. So here's a little example of something which is open-ended to a human, but isn't open-ended to a mouse and an alien, just to make the point that open-endedness is observer-dependent. So if you think about the history of aerospace, you produce aeroplanes, maybe you produce jets, maybe you produce things that will fly in space. If you're a mouse, all of these things look novel to you, maybe increasingly novel. Maybe you're increasingly surprised. They're bigger, they're better, they're faster. They're more out of distribution for a mouse. They are not learnable, however. If you ask the mouse, okay, well, is the thing in space more predictable given having seen the lineage of aeroplanes? It cannot give you a sensible answer to that. Human thinks they're both novel and learnable. The alien knows everything there is. It's a super intelligent alien, as you can see. And the alien knows everything there is to know about aerospace. So it's finding these things learnable, right? It understands that they're coming in an order and why they're coming in order, but they are not novel. So this is a little illustration of the importance of the observer and the observer's loss function. One other thing about this definition, and then I'll close by talking about what I mean by open-ended cooperative AI, is that this definition has a really nice property, and this is really, I should attribute this to Michael, because he thought much more about safety in this context than I have. It's got this really nice property of safety by design. Why do I say that? Well, there are two properties I claim you want for safety in an open-ended system. One of them, you don't want a system of AIs to constrain the space of opportunities that humans have for exploration. This point I also should attribute to Gillian. She made that point very eloquently to me the other day. We don't want to be in a situation where the AI starts to prevent us from doing things that otherwise would be good for us to do. And so we want there to be novelty, right? We want to maintain the novelty. That means that we can still expand into these spaces. However, we also do not want that system to start doing things that we do not understand and cannot control. But that is, of course, guaranteed by learnability. So long as we, as the human observer, keep finding something open-ended, then we are good to go, in some sense. Or at least that's a necessary condition that we're good to go, possibly not a sufficient one. If we stop finding it open-ended, then we should really be worried. So this is, in some sense, the definition bakes in a safety requirement. Okay, so I will finish having given just a couple of slides about the title of the talk. So hopefully you're a little bit less confused than you were. At least now you know what open-ended this is. What is open-ended cooperative AI? Well, I talked about the importance of cooperation earlier, and I left you with this question: where has cooperation gone? I'm going to tell you where it's gone, which is going to give you a bunch of research ideas that we can discuss straight after this. So firstly, where did cooperation go in this notion of allowing species to coexist in separate niches? Well, actually, map elites had that in it, right? It hand-engineered the fact that the algorithms couldn't replace each other in different niches. And in fact, that's the same thing that is engineered into OmniEpic. we haven't figured out how cooperation can drive coexistence in open-endedness yet. So cooperation seems to do this in natural open-endedness. The open-endedness community, I think, don't really know enough about this. So I think there's a big space of open-ended algorithms that could be based on cooperation. Second thing is we had this idea of unlocking the next level of energy abundance, so relaxing the selection pressure. This is kind of akin to constructing the feature space as you go. So we define the feature space in a bunch of these algorithms. What if you constructed it the way humans construct our feature space, or indeed evolution constructs its feature space as you go, is by cooperating and then therefore discovering new ways and new niches that are that can be exploited by the cooperative entity. I think OmniEpic starts to do this, but there's a lot more space to work with here. And then there's another area that, again, the openness community just kind of don't know enough about, which is that cooperation itself is a source of challenges for a group to overcome. And there's a bunch of people working on multi-agent systems where you have collaborative agents, but they haven't realized that this might give you open-ended solutions to things, or at least they haven't framed it in terms of open-endedness. So I think there's another big space of ideas from cooperation and open-endedness that will sort of come together. Okay, so then finally, a definition of open-ended cooperative AI, you could say, is the application of open-endedness methods to cooperative AI problems and the application of cooperative AI methods to open-endedness problems. And I'll leave you with a little bit of justification for why they are a good match for each other. So in one direction, cooperative AI really needs open-endedness. You should be aware and you should want to work, I claim, on open-endedness if you're interested in cooperative AI. And there are 4 reasons for this. Firstly, we actually don't know what's coming when we put these powerful AI systems into society. In some sense, we can't know what's coming because society is more complicated than any individual AI system will be. And when you put that AI system into society, that AI system will influence society in a way that's more complicated. And then when you have copies of that AI system, which is kind of inevitable because they're digital, their information technology wants to be free, it wants to be copied. This is necessarily more complicated than the individual AI system. So we're always going to be in the case that we're chasing our tails. Secondly, the number of interacting AI systems may explode suddenly. And we've seen that with a bunch of technology adoption. It tends to happen very quickly. It might happen with Apple Intelligence. This might be the case that in 9 months' time, suddenly everyone is using AI systems to mediate between each other. And that could happen almost overnight. Secondly, our norms and institutions move slowly, and AI is very likely to move faster than them. Technology usually does. And it won't necessarily co-create them unless we do our work and make that happen. There's good evidence here in a paper by Rao et al. About how AI can understand norms, but it's not very good at adapting to norms. So already we know that this is a kind of problem that's out there empirically. This is what open-endedness solves. If you've understood one thing from this talk, it's that open-endedness creates problems and solves them, and it keeps doing that endlessly. So open-endedness is the thing that we need to solve the problems that I've talked about. That's why we need to know about it. Last slide. Open-endedness needs cooperative AI. So it's not just a one-way thing. I'm not coming here and saying, hey, I've got my gadget to sell by my gadget. We have got a gadget to sell to open-endedness, equally importantly. So firstly, foundation models I've claimed are the things that can take open-endedness to the next level, but they are not going to extend it to human level and possibly beyond human level, because foundation models are just trained on the cooperative culture we have now, right? If we want open-ended algorithms that keep going, then we've got to extend the culture that they are trained on. And that probably means we need to understand the role of cooperation to do things like create the feature space on the fly. Secondly, as I just said, open-endedness by definition, at least by the definition that Michael and I and others at DeepMind have just come up with, must be legible to humans. And that means that they must be predictable, controllable by humans, and that is right at the heart of what we're interested in this community. Also, our cooperative infrastructure has got to adapt to open-endedness. Sam Altman's already talking about automating the process of doing AI research. If that comes to fruition in the next 5, 10, 15 years, that's an open-ended system that's potentially going to ratchet the pace of technology development. We don't know what that's going to do to society, but we need to be thinking about that, and we are the community who is best equipped to do that. So thank you for bearing with me, organisers. I'm going to stop there. Please do ask questions and then come find me afterwards.
Thanks, Ed. We'll do an abridged question session, and then Ed will have 2 office hour slots afterwards. So, question 1, evolution didn't discover wheels, implying open-ended systems sometimes can't find optimal solutions. Are there capabilities you think are beyond your agenda? And then some wheel-related emojis.
Awesome. Yes, it's a great question. Evolution did discover wheels, of course. It wasn't biological evolution that discovered wheels. It was cultural evolution that discovered wheels. So why doesn't biological evolution discover wheels? Well, evolution has an exploration problem, if you like, or an exploration feature. It explores in the space of the genotype, and if that genotype is at the wrong level of abstraction, then it doesn't explore very well. It's a problem that reinforcement learning actually also has. So what's the problem with the genotype in biological evolution? Well, it's you're mutating genes, which if you're kind of a very small bacterium is kind of quite related to the things you might want to do in your environment, right? You haven't got a very big genome. There's not a huge amount of stuff that you're doing, and you're assembling, probably the way in which you mutate a gene changes the proteins that you're making in such a way that might actually affect the autocatalytic process relatively swiftly. If you're a human, if you mutate a gene, well, often that's cancer, and then if it's in the germline, then, okay, sometimes that's a beneficial adaptation, but quite often that's not a beneficial adaptation, right? It's quite often something that throws out of whack the whole system in which, that's the whole homeostasis of the system in which the body has to exist. Okay, so what's the problem with exploration in reinforcement learning? Why couldn't you just do it that way? Well, exploration in reinforcement learning is in the space of actions, and that's getting drunk, which sometimes is a good form of exploration, but it's not often the best form of exploration for your PhD. What does cultural evolution do? Well, it explores in the space of ideas or artifacts. So how did a wheel come about? Well, I don't know the exact history of how a wheel came about, but if you, here's a story that's at least true for stone tools, and it probably applies to a wheel as well. Individuals start realizing that you can make things roll at some point, and then they start telling other people about things that make things roll, and then they kind of make something that's a little bit smaller and sort of better at rolling out of maybe stones. And then maybe someone goes, okay, well, if I could kind of just make that a bit like a cylinder rather than a sphere, that would be easier. It'd be easier to attach to things. And it's kind of a proto wheel, and everyone then kind of iterates very slowly on these things, and eventually there is somebody who kind of produces something which is wheel-like, and importantly tells everyone about it. Right now you have a piece of knowledge that everyone has to know, and once you've got that piece of knowledge, then if enough people know about it, no one forgets about it. We then have wheels forever. So the last bit of the question: is there anything that my agenda doesn't take into account? Almost certainly. I'm not claiming that this does everything. So I think that was the part of the question I agree with. However, I think it is a missing, I think to Lewis's point, it's a neglected and tractable piece, and there aren't lots of people working on it. You saw a lot of these, a lot of the same names coming up, and it's something that's eminently studyable with academic compute as well. You don't need a huge amount of compute to do this. You do it by prompting language models and writing a bit of code, and a lot of the work, in fact, was done in academia that I showed you.
All right, just one more, because I think this is an important question. Do you worry about these methods leading to dangerous new AI capabilities, and do you have thoughts on mitigating that risk?
Yes. First question, yes, absolutely. I think it's definitely, we should worry about these creating new dangerous new AI capabilities. Any form of discovery does. At the moment we are doing that with humans firmly in the loop as to the process of that discovery. So the cultural system, if you like, is producing new AI in a way that any of us individually can't control, in a way that actually Sam Altman, Demis Hassabis probably can't control. No individual human can control that. But at least, there is this, the researcher is in the loop, and maybe we can make some assumption that the researcher is value aligned with humanity. that assumption may or may not be true, but I think in general it's probably more true than we can make that assumption for language models or for AI systems. So I think we have to be very careful and very responsible in doing this. There are huge benefits potentially if we get this right. We can accelerate science, we can accelerate technology, we can bring about changes, make new discoveries that are of huge societal benefit, and we can do so in a way that, and we can discover new modes of cooperation that make society better off. But we do have to do this responsibly. And so what ideas do I have in terms of in terms of how we do that? I think there's three things that are really important. I think one of them is increasing focus on evaluation of open-ended systems. And in particular, evaluation has to be open-ended. At the moment, you look at large language model evaluations, and they are just taking data sets from 5 years ago and going, we now got 88.7% on GSM-8K. So, this is not the kind of evaluation we need. We need the evaluation to be open-ended, and we need it to be societal. So I don't really care how good a language model is at doing this one thing. I care about how has it persuaded my friend to now behave in a less cooperative way towards me. Those just don't exist really at the moment. So we need to crack that, and crack that soon. Second thing is we need to be on the lookout for if the system stops being open-ended, right? And if the system stops being open-ended, that could be in two ways. Either somehow it's constraining human creativity, or because we now don't understand what it's doing. And that's, we need to build in mechanisms to understand that at a high level. And thirdly, I think there's more of a kind of sociological point. We need more people to be aware of this, right? So you now know something about this. Whoever asked the question, it's a brilliant question. Go out there and tell people in the alignment community about this, tell people in the policy community about this. Don't deliberately scare them, but just make them aware that they should be thinking, they should be feeding into the discussion and making this something that all of society can participate in.
All right. One more round of applause for Ed, please.